My best friend recently moved to a small town for his bachelor studies. It's the type of place where there's more trees and greenery than buildings. Just a tiny student town that feels like it was built exclusively to function around its university. And honestly, knowing how old the university is, it probably was. The town is pretty charming overall. The buildings are all very old-fashioned and picturesque. However, at night the whole town gets dark, especially in the forest areas. The street lighting was already pretty scarce, but on the borders, surrounded by nothing but trees obscuring the moonlight, nights would become pitch black, and everyone would often struggle to properly see even things that were right in front of them. My friend told me it was all done with the intention of avoiding light pollution and reducing energy costs. It made sense, but after what we went through, I wonder if they try to keep the nights dark too. Hide something. Let me explain what I mean. As normal university students often do, my best friend would to lots of parties around his town. He is a bit of a social butterfly and had no trouble getting himself a huge group of friends that would be up to something almost every single day. Therefore, being a relatively large group of poor university students looking for a cheap but fun night out, it was only a matter of time till one of their favorite weekend activities became the Forest Ragers. In the summer nights, the weather was warm enough to, instead of having to pay a lot of money to get into a club or get some drinks at a bar, just buy some beer cases or some stronger alcohol and take them along with a proper speaker and some lights to the nearest forest clearing. It saved the host the trouble of trying to deal with the police or annoying neighbors when throwing a party at your own place, as well as not having a lot of cleaning up to do. Plus, it gave the whole event more of like an underground, wild feeling. Needless to say, they were happening around 4 times a week in the summer months, and my friend would not be one to miss any. Having finally some free time with my own studies, I decided to finally pay him a visit for a weekend. It'd been quite a while, so I was really eager to finally see him again, and I wanted to get a little taste of his wild student life as well. He gladly took me in, and since it was still early August, he decided to personally organize a forest rager, so I would get the full experience in my visit. So, there we went. After spending the entire day walking around the city, getting to know all the touristy spots, which honestly weren't many, and chilling by a nearby lake, it was time for the forest rager to begin. I helped him carry the drinks and the speaker to the forest clearing they'd most often use, one that was just a short bus drive and a walk away from his place. It was just far enough for there to be no noise complaints from anyone around, but close enough for it to be easily accessible for all the partygoers. As we got there, and the night began to fall though, I was immediately taken aback by the darkness. They set up some LEDs and some cheap battery-powered lights in some of the trees, but as for the rest of the forest surrounding us, I would have trouble distinguishing even the outline of my hand in front of my face. It wasn't normal, in hindsight. Like the treetops weren't even that close-knit together, how come no moonlight at all was passing through them? Everyone would walk around with their phone flashlights when they were coming in, trying to avoid tripping on any loose branches or uneven patches of floor. I immediately realized that if someone got lost with no phone battery, even if not that far away, they'd have a really hard time finding their way back. Well, all those were my main concerns at first, but to be honest, once the people started arriving and the party was in full speed, I stopped thinking about that completely. We had a really good time, and to be quite honest, I ended up drinking way more than what I intended to. It was true, to an extent. Partying in the woods, in the middle of nowhere, did bring more of your wild side out. At some point I lost sight of my best friend and ended up striking conversation with this really nice friend of his. Well, one thing led to another, and soon we were making out on the border of the clearing. Things were starting to get heated up, and like an idiot, I suggested we go further into the woods to get more privacy. So, there we were, right in the middle of the darkest forest on Earth, trying to somehow find our way back to the party after having had some mildly disappointing drunken sex. My phone had just run out of battery, and he had no idea where he had left his even before we left the clearing behind. We kept moving as best as we could, trying to retrace our steps back to the clearing, but to be honest, neither of us was sure if we were in the right direction. The darkness, it was disorienting. It felt oppressive, heavy, as if we both suddenly gone blind. I began to slowly lose my temper, and desperation started to creep up on me. I began to notice how quiet the forest was. That's when it began to sink on me. None of this felt natural. There were no sounds on the forest, no light seeped through, no distinct forest smells. I asked the guy if it was always this way, and he said he wasn't really sure. He hadn't paid much attention to it before today, but he was sure it was not like this in daytime. A strange feeling began to grow in me, and I began walking faster. He matched my pace, and we both grew extremely quiet as we trekked increasingly faster and more desperate. I recognized the feeling then. It was dread. I was breathing faster and faster as we walked along, but we seemed to make no progress at all in that block of blackness that seemed to have engulfed us. All trees looked the same. I had lost track of time. We could have been walking for hours, for all I know. I sat down in exasperation and started crying. The guy tried to comfort me, but I knew he was as scared as I was. We both sat down, trying to gather our thoughts and come up with a better idea. Suddenly, we heard this faint, high-pitched noise coming from somewhere around us. It sounded like someone screaming, shrieking, even. It shook me to my core. I began to hyperventilate, asking the guy what the sound was but getting no answer back. It slowly seemed to get stronger and closer while becoming even more high-pitched, distorting itself. That's when we saw it. A luminous white splotch approached from between two trees, barely illuminating its surroundings with its natural light. It was mesmerizing. The closer it came, the more I noticed its humanoid shape, floating with ease through the woods, contrasting with its erratic, unnatural movements. It had no distinguishable face or features whatsoever. All of my muscles tensed. It was like an instinctive reaction. I only had one word on my mind: run. I grabbed the guy's hand and bolted in the opposite direction, pulling him away from the creature without looking back. We ran until we literally couldn't keep going. My lungs burned, but not as much as my full body repulsion and instinctive desire to get away. It triggered a sort of primal fear, something I'd never felt before. We kept on walking, not saying a peep, and the sun began to slowly rise. The sounds and the smells of the forest returned. It was like a spell was broken. I recognized the clearing, not far away from where we were. We'd somehow found our way back. When we got to the clearing, there were still some people there, including my best friend, sitting around and drinking. I tried to tell them what we'd seen, but honestly, no one seemed to believe much of it. And the guy I'd been with was also super dismissive of the story. I could see it in his eyes, though. He'd rather pretend it never happened. I can't blame him for it. I don't know what we saw. Alcohol doesn't really make you hallucinate, and even if I prefer to believe it didn't happen, I know it did. I haven't really been back to the town again, and I'm not sure if I would ever feel like going again. Something roams that forest, something dangerous. We found a skeleton in the woods once, back at my grandma's house, out in the countryside. This was back when I was around 11 years old and used to spend the summer with her. My grandma was always a bit of an outsider, ever since I can remember. She was the black sheep of the family. She'd never come to family reunions because she refused to come into the city ever since she moved to the outskirts after Grandpa died. Despite it all, though, she and my mom had a pretty good relationship. They'd stay in touch over the phone and talk almost every day. I don't even know how many interesting things old lady living in a farmhouse by herself could have to tell, but they talked regardless, and often for hours. Anyways, since my mom was very close to her, she wanted me to be close to her as well, so most summers she'd send me to spend around 3 weeks at Grandma's house. I wish I could tell me and Grandma bonded over these visits, and that I would have the best time ever. But the truth is, she was a strange old lady. She'd have her windowsills covered in salt to fend off bad spirits, several dream catchers hanging on every room of the house, and all sorts of incenses burning constantly over the course of the day. She'd let me use electricity, but she personally preferred to keep every room dark when the night came, and only use candles to not disturb the slumber of the night and mess up the energies, she'd say. You get the idea. She was this superstitious, extravagant old lady, and I would spend these weeks mostly by myself at the nearby lake, trying to fight off the heat and avoid the dizzying smell of the incense for as long as I could. All of my visits have become a blur in my memory over the years, except for one, my last one. What happened? It always remained at the back of my mind. I wasn't even sure if I dreamed it or not. It felt so surreal. Now I'm sure it really happened, though. It's been really bothering me for the last few days. Let me just tell you what went on. As any other day, I was coming back to her place for lunch after having spent all morning swing by the lake. As soon as I got in, she told me to take a shower and come down to eat, just as usual. Once I came down, though, I saw lunch was gonna be much more special. She'd always cook simple, light meals for lunch, claiming it was healthier and better for our energies, but not this time. She prepared a magnificent-looking pork roast, along with some boiled potatoes with sour cream, and for dessert, I creamed with hot chocolate fudge. I was amazed. I don't think I'd ever eaten such an amazing meal at Grandma's. I asked what the special occasion was, and she told me that today she was gonna take me with her to the woods for the first time. It was honestly the first time she'd ever proposed doing something together, so I was actually very excited. So, just as promised, after lunch we picked up the table, my grandma readied herself, and we set on our way to the woods. Living in the countryside, the woods were actually not far away from her house, so she told me we'd be going by foot. And so, we did. We walked for around 15 minutes, and we were entering the gigantic forest that surrounded my grandma's place. It was actually beautiful. I remember the little rays of sunlight slipping through the canopy, giving the place a magical, almost ethereal vibe, where the shadows provided a stark contrast to the bright spots of sun. Birds flew by. A squirrel climbed a tree next to me. I was fascinated. However, Grandma didn't give me a lot of time to wander around. She immediately began to walk deeper into the woods and told me to follow her closely. I had no choice but to do so. An hour into walking, and I started to get a little bit nervous. I kept asking Grandma where we were going, but she just kept telling me to follow her in silence. The woods were getting very dense. The trees were growing closer together, their infinite branches and leaves letting less and less sunlight pass through, making the forest grow darker, and in turn, gloomier. We kept moving forward, though, avoiding huge roots that occupy the patch more frequently with every step of our way. I began hearing noises. These weird, shrilling chirpings that didn't sound like any bird I'd listened to before, and I could swear there was this noise floating around us. It really sounded like whispers. I asked Grandma if we could go back home, but it was useless. She kept on walking, insisting we were almost there. I don't really know if I'm remembering all that well, or if my faulty memory is making it all seem creepier than how it actually was, but I could swear I began seeing these shadows, moving across the forest, just out of sight, sprinting from tree to tree, rustling the leaves. I'm getting goosebumps just from remembering. They didn't feel like people. People couldn't move like that. What would a bunch of people would be doing in the middle of this forest, just running around and avoiding us? What were we doing there in the first place? Where was Grandma taking me? After walking for what felt like 3 hours, we reached this clearing, where the trees suddenly opened up to leave a wide open space. I was taken aback. Somehow, it was already getting dark, even though it was summer, and he'd left the house pretty early. I tried to point it out to Grandma, But she ignored my comment as she walked towards the center of the clearing. I began to follow her, but suddenly stopped. My whole being was completely on edge. Something felt really wrong, and I didn't want to walk any closer. My grandma reached the center of the clearing and turned back to me. She saw the distress in my face and tried to comfort me, telling me there was nothing to worry about. Her face was strange, emotionless, stiff, almost blank. It didn't help me feel reassured at all. She was standing by what seemed like white sticks and stones spread across the center of the clearing. Not knowing what else to do, I began slowly walking towards her, each step making me dizzier, getting my breath heavier. I don't know exactly what had me so terrified, but I was freaked out of my mind. As I got closer, though, I stopped dead on my tracks. Those were no sticks and stones. Those were bones. At first, I thought they might belong to an animal. But then I saw a skull, smiling back at me with its white, dried teeth. I bolted out of there, leaving my grandma's screams behind. I ran, not sure where I was going, just wanting to get as far away from that place as possible. The sounds of the forest became unbearable. Unintelligible whispers would come straight to my ears out of nowhere. The chirpings felt painful and unbearably loud. I just kept on running, gaze fixed to the ground to avoid tripping myself. It's the longest I've ever ran in my life. Somehow, I made it out. I was standing at the edge through which we'd gone in from. The chirpings, the whispers, and my grandma's screams had been left far behind. Exhausted, shaky, and exasperated, I walked back to my grandma's house. Fortunately, the door had been left unlocked. I got in and called my parents to tell them to pick me up. As I waited, I hid inside a closet, terrified of what my grandma would do if she came back and found me. She never returned, though, not at least before my parents arrived. That night I went back home and explained everything to them. They didn't really believe most of it, but they saw how terrified I was. I never saw Grandma again, nor did I ever want to. The calls between her and my mom stopped, and we never visited again. She was still living there, as far as I knew, out in the countryside. As I got older, I began doubting this story myself, and would often attribute most of it to my imagination, or the fantasies I might have mixed in when I dreamed about it. I knew something had happened with Grandma, but neither I nor my mom ever addressed it, and I felt like it was a really touchy subject for her. So in the process of avoiding it, I ended up just mostly forgetting about it. She passed away last week, though. My grandma. I wasn't gonna go to the funeral, but one of my cousins I hadn't seen in a long time was gonna be there. After the funeral, we all went to her house. The memories kept flooding in. I kept telling myself I'd imagined them, but being there again, reliving how I felt, I couldn't keep lying to myself. And then I saw her. As I stared out of the windows of her house, towards the forest, I swear I could see my grandma among the trees, still calling for me. I drove home right after that. I'm never setting foot on that place again. I used to really enjoy my forest walks. Most afternoons you could find me on my daily trek through the woods near my apartment. Be it any season, walking among the trees has an ethereal, otherworldly quality to it. The sounds, the smells, the views of nature, and the illusion of isolation and stillness it would bring, all really helping me disconnect a bit from whatever was going on in my life. I found it really enchanting. Now I'm not really sure I ever want to go back. Forests may hide things I would rather stay away from. I was deep into my forest walk, my mind wandering free as I kept moving through the paths. The weather was already getting pretty cold, and I had gone out much later in the day than I usually do, so I didn't run into a single soul as I delved deeper into the woods. It was just me, the trees, and whatever lived among them. Suddenly, I spotted a rabbit. Excited and a little surprised, as one doesn't tend to see many rabbits roaming around at the beginning of winter, I began carefully and silently following it through the forest, trying to see if I could find out where it was going. I don't know how long I walked, or how did I manage to never scare it away. But somehow, completely fixated and absorbed into the task, I completely lost my sense of direction, and when the rabbit finally scurried away from my sight, I realized I had no idea where I was. No walking path was visible, and the trees grew closer together, making it difficult to get a proper look of my surroundings. It didn't look like any part of the forest I'd ever visited before. The trees looked different, more reddish, with a thinner trunk than the ones I was used to. I didn't panic though. The forest made me feel very at peace, so I wasn't worried if finding a way back took me a little while. And I was sure that by walking back on the direction I'd come from, I would eventually run into a walking path I could follow into civilization. After all, this forest was right next to the city. It couldn't be that big. I was right. After walking for around half an hour, I found a forest path again. I was about to start following it when I saw something that caught my eye. There, not far away from where I stood, was this formation. I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I could see better what it was. These 3 trees that'd grown tangled around each other. Their trunks twisted and turned, intermingling among one another until their cups extended to the sky in different directions. They formed this beautiful, strange knot, grown perfectly naturally. That was not the only thing, though. All the other trees, they were growing at least a few feet apart from these knotted trees, leaving this circle of empty soil around them. It was a really strange sight. Delighted, I stepped closer and took some photos of the knotted trees. As soon as I approached them, though, there was this feeling. The best way I would describe is impending doom. They felt alive and hostile, like a wild animal. Don't get me wrong. It's not like the trees growled at me or anything. It just felt that way, like they, or something in them, maybe were warning me not to lay a hand on them. I instinctively removed my hand and stepped away. A shiver ran through my spine, and I wasn't really sure why. Anyways, the sky was getting dark already, so I figured I should be on my way. As I turned to walk away, though, I could swear I felt eyes on me, watching me leave. The strangest thing, though, was that the feeling never really went away until I stepped out of the forest. I felt eyes everywhere. I got really nervous and began walking faster and faster. In the end, I was almost running. I got out of the forest and came out to the driveway, breathless. And just like that, the feeling was gone, leaving me just a bit shaken. I didn't pay much attention to it, though. I just figured I had gotten way too much into my own head. I walked home, a little bit of fear still lingering, but trying to drive it out of my mind. By the time I got inside my apartment, I was already feeling silly, running scared out of the forest like that. However, as I sat down and checked the pictures, wanting to give the tree formation another look, they were a mess. Blurry, dark photos where nothing was recognizable was the only thing I found in my gallery. That did strike me as odd. I could swear the photos hadn't been blurry when I'd taken them. I shrugged it off as well, though, thinking something simply might have gone wrong with the phone's camera, and didn't think anything of it the rest of the afternoon. I woke up the next day and went to work as usual. However, all morning I couldn't shake off the feeling that I dreamed about the tree knot, and it gave me an inexplicable sense of dread. That, coupled with the fact that my head and my body were the entire day making me feel like I hadn't had any proper sleep, made me decided I'd try to find the tree knot again that same afternoon. There was something about it that was really bothering me, and I was clearly not gonna be at peace until I figured out what it was. Therefore, as promised, I was heading down back into the woods that same afternoon, trying to retrace my steps from the previous day. It wasn't easy at all. I hadn't been paying any attention when I was following the rabbit, so there were no specific landmarks I remembered to try to follow. Plus, to be honest, it's really hard finding your way through a forest overall. I walked pretty the entire afternoon, seeing if I could catch any glimpse of those different trees that surrounded the area I'd been in. Eventually, as if the forest itself knew what I was looking for, I found myself in the same spot from yesterday, even though I could swear at this point I was walking in another direction completely. The night had caught up to me, but I could still recognize the reddish, thinner trees and the way they grew closer together. I began delving through them, and I saw the knot. It stood there, it in its circle of isolation, and for the first time it struck me how unnatural it looked. I began approaching, and the sense of doom returned. Hesitant to get any closer, I took out my phone again and took a picture. I immediately checked it, and sure enough, it was blurry again. I thought maybe it was an issue with my camera and took a random photo of the trees behind me in order to test it. The photo came out perfectly fine this time. Something was wrong with those trees. I began approaching. With every step, the dread increased, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand was extended. I needed to touch the knot. My hand was inches away, and my heart felt like it was being squeezed tight. My head began spinning. My mind screamed at me to stop. Tears began rolling down my cheeks, but I couldn't help myself. As I touched the knot, this shrilling, piercing shriek pierced the stillness of the night. My fight or flight response finally managed to kick in, and I bolted straight in the opposite direction. Something was following me. I ran, but I could hear other pair of feet right behind me, trotting at full speed towards me. I refused to look back and ran for dear life, trying not to scream. The creature came closer every second. I could hear their breath right behind my neck. I saw the street, not far away, and somehow bolted even faster as the thing grabbed my winter jacket and ripped it effortlessly out of me. I jumped out of the forest and landed hard on the pavement. The dread immediately vanished. I looked behind me and only saw the forest, extending ominously in the darkness. I ran all the way home, always glancing behind my back. It's been a while since then, and I have refused to get close to any forests ever since. I've visited a psychiatrist and gone over this incident many times. They say it was probably some sort of stress-induced hallucination, which can be pretty common in my line of work. I still lost my winter jacket. I still hear shrieks coming from the woods sometimes. This was no hallucination. Something hides inside, and I'm never going back to find out what it may be.